I want to take a chance now to talk to you about air quality. This is particularly a problem in Utah, and you hear about it a lot on the news, you read about it in the papers, and want to take some time to dig into the science behind it and talk why we have the air quality problems we do and how the different organs are impacted, including the kidneys, and then circle back to what I tell my patients about air quality and how I bring it into my practice. Now, just a bit of background, I came to Utah in 2007 and came from the Midwest, didn't know a whole lot about air quality, and I didn't know what an inversion was, so I got here and began to make these discoveries. And through some good fortune, I ended up actually getting heavily involved and ended up on the State Air Quality Board for about 8 years and involved in UCARE, an organization that works to have people change their behavior to improve air quality, and have been very involved with all this. We also started a program for air quality health and society at the University of Utah, recognizing that air quality involves not just individual groups of physicians, but it needs atmospheric scientists, engineers, it needs urban planners, lots of people coming together to think about how we can solve these problems. So we've been heavily engaged in working on air quality now for a number of years and have made really very nice strides. See if I can actually, my disclosures, I have some grant funding from the NIH and the Department of Veterans Affairs, and I'm a consultant for a company called Partner Therapeutics, which has nothing to do with the content in this talk. I'm not going to be mentioning any drugs. Some of the questions we ought to be thinking about as we go through all this: why do we care about air pollution? Obviously, it's unsightly, it can smell bad, but what are really the important points we need to know in terms of health? How it affects health? Do changing pollution levels lead to clinically important changes in health? What are the biological responses involved? What are the individual organ systems? And what's going on in Utah? Why do we have the issues that we do showing up the way that we do? I'll also wave at COVID-19 and talk about a relationship between air quality and susceptibility to COVID-19. Now, a lot of our thoughts about air pollution date back to 1952. And there was a major event in England focused on London. At that point, London was generating most of its heat from coal-fired fireplaces and furnaces, and it also had lots of industry around. And these pictures were taken during an inversion in London during the day. And if I can make my pointer work, so, you know, the roads you could barely pass because it was the smog was so thick. This was taken actually Piccadilly Circle during the daytime with all the lights on, showing you just how incredibly dense this problem was. If any of you have seen The Crown, the series on Netflix, actually Winston Churchill had a major crisis around this that led to political vulnerability for him. So this is the data on what happened. And you see, they weren't measuring some of the usual pollution measures we measure. They talked about just smoke and sulfur dioxide in terms of milligrams per meter cubed. And we go along in November and December, and the white and yellow, the smoke and the sulfur dioxide went up. And here's deaths that took off from about 300 a day normally in London up to over 1,000 a day, came down and had a considerable tail. There were several thousand people who died in response to this few days of bad smog. Thanks to that and similar kinds of events, there was great recognition of the health problems related to air pollution. We started tracking it, measuring it, and understanding it much better. Now, there are important worldwide causes of poor air quality: transportation, solid fuel burning, power generation, municipal waste management, waste incineration, agricultural burning, in particular wildland fires, that we'll talk about in a minute, and local meteorology and topography has a huge contribution. The EPA, formed in 1970, defined criteria air pollutants. Those are the things that they track and that are particularly important, that they set guidelines for. The major ones, and the ones I'll touch on today, include particulate matter, and I'll define PM 2.5 for you, and ozone, lead, carbon monoxides, sulfur and nitrogen oxides are very important, and then there's another group called air toxics that are evil things that go into the air. And PM 2.5 is what we spend a lot of our time talking about here, because it's the key thing in our wintertime inversions. It's also one of the key contributors to pollution in wildland fire smoke. And the 2.5 relates to the aerodynamic diameter, 2.5 microns. Now, when I'm teaching the medical students about the lungs and how you get inhaled medications out into the lungs, we point out that if you wanted to make a drug just to get to the real action area of the lung, out to the small airways and the alveolar space, you'd make it between 2 and 5 microns. Larger particles get filtered out in the nose, in the upper airways at branch points. They hang up in mucus. And some of the very, very fine things go in and come back out. But around 2.5 microns is the perfect place if you want to get something into the lungs and have it deposit in the small airways in the alveolar space. That's the right size. So that's why the EPA pays attention to that number. Okay, they didn't just make it up. And to give you a sense of the size, let's see if I can figure out going back. Yeah. Here's a human hair, some grains of sand at about 90 microns. Mold, dust, pollen are about 10 microns, and PM 2.5 is real small. Now, pollution due to PM 2.5 is a problem worldwide. And in fact, we're quite fortunate. It's nowhere near as bad here as it is in many other areas. This is, again, sub-Saharan Africa, on across through the Indian subcontinent and into China. You have tremendous levels. We're not so bad, but we have our episodic issues here in Utah that I'll talk about in a second. But if you want to think about the global burden of all this, we know that in 2019 they estimated that about 4 million people worldwide died of outdoor air pollution. It's a huge burden. The other part of air pollution that I'm not going to talk about today, but I need to mention here, is indoor air pollution due to solid fuel burning. And this is a problem particularly in the developing world, where people are burning wood, coal, dung, all sorts of things, and it's a particular burden for women who are often cooking. It's also an issue for heating. And this contributes many, many more lives lost. So the total number of lives lost to air pollution per year is probably 8 to 9 million. And that may actually be an underestimate. So what are our sources of pollution? We have the mobile sources, we have our homes, we have factories, point sources, and they all make PM 2.5 and NOx and volatile organic compounds. And many people have misunderstanding as to what goes on in Utah and what contributes to our pollution problems. Mobile sources, our cars, trucks, ATVs are actually the largest source. They contribute about a little over half of the emissions. They're decreasing. Thanks to regulations on emissions, catalytic converters and all, we're actually doing much better than we used to. Area sources, your home, the hot water heater, the furnace, the local dry cleaner, the local pizza oven, those contribute about a third at this point. Those are going up. And we're guessing that by 2050, we'll actually have area sources as the major source of pollution in the state, and that mobile sources will be in second place. Point sources, the big smokestacks, they're a big deal, but they've been very heavily regulated, and they're down to about 12% of emissions. But they're going up as the population grows, as there's more business in the state. They're highly regulated, but with increased activity, their contribution is in fact increasing. Now, part of the reason we have the problem we do is shown here. This is the Salt Lake Valley, I-15 running up and down. We've got Kennecott and lots of industry all around. We have the dust blowing in off the lake, and it's all rimmed by these mountains. You've got a version of that up here. You know, all along the Wasatch Front, we have different air sheds that have essentially the same issue. And what we have is wintertime inversions. With these, we have cold air that gets trapped with warm air above. Normally you would expect the warmer air near the ground and the colder air up high. And when we get these things during the winter, these cold pools that trap, in the setting particularly of snow on the ground and sunshine, you get the conditions for an inversion, and everything emitted into here stays, and it cooks and changes, and I'll show you how that happens, and we end up with the air quality problems that we have. So when we talk about where our pollution comes from during the inversions, only about a third of the particles are directly emitted as particles, and they come from all these, yes, from point sources and tailpipes and homes. But all this stuff is emitted into the atmosphere where magic occurs in a black box, and we convert it into more particles. And the meteorology, the sunshine, the humidity contribute to that. And we end up with about 2/3 of our particulate matter during an inversion generated in the atmosphere from all the other stuff that was emitted. Now, some people have gotten confused about this and said, oh, that must mean that 2/3 don't come from humans. No, it's coming from humans, but it's not emitted as particles. It's emitted as NOx and sulfur dioxides and things like that that then turn into particles once they're in the atmosphere. So we contribute to all of it. So this is a typical picture of a wintertime inversion in Salt Lake City. Here's PM 2.5 levels. You may have heard the EPA standard for what's unsafe is the major cutoff is at 35 micrograms per cubic meter, this blue line. Now, whether that's the right number is a big subject for debate, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later on, but that's in the regulations. What the State Air Quality Board pays attention to is that. So we were going along and things were fine, and then suddenly we built up an inversion and we got up to 55 micrograms per cubic meter. These are 24-hour averages. And then a storm comes through and blows it all away. And then it builds up again when we get a high pressure area, and we got up above 60. Storm blows it away, and we get another one, and then storm clears it, and the rest of the month is good. Just for perspective, the annual average in Beijing every day is 75. So we have problems, but these problems are small in many ways compared to the global troubles in Delhi, in Beijing, and so on. Now, the way this works, again, this is from a different time period. We measure PM 2.5, both the red here is a 1-hour reading and the blue is the 24-hour reading. So what happens is it comes up and it builds up, it builds up, it builds up, and we go from starting out at about 20 up to 60 over 4 days here with ever-increasing levels. So how important is this? Is this just a bunch of numbers, or does this actually do anything to folks? And there's been an enormous literature looking at the health effects. And I'm not going to try to tell you all about it. I'm going to summarize some points and then show you a couple of my favorite studies that just illustrate. So there's lots of epidemiologic data linking air pollution to human health. If you live with worse air pollution, you have a higher mortality rate, shorter life expectancy. Again, the global burden of disease study that shows up in Lancet every year says about 9 million total deaths in 2019. We know that a real big part of this is cardiovascular disease, but it also worsens asthma, it worsens COPD, and it can be a major factor contributing to risk of cancer, both lung cancer and other cancers. So some of the data comes when we really drill down and say, okay, well, and not just doing let's drill down and compare some of our cities in the United States where we have different air quality, and we're going to do very sophisticated studies of what the water quality is, availability of health care, how the population, how much it smokes, things like that, and see what the contribution of air pollution is. And this has the very catchy name of the 6 city studies that looked at 6 cities. And they looked at these cities across the United States. Portage was their reference city, and here's mortality rate on this vertical axis. And here's the average fine particles, PM2.5, on the horizontal axis. And there's a remarkable line when you control for all the other health characteristics. There's this amazing straight line that says if you've got higher levels of particulate pollution, you've got a higher mortality rate. Now, we know that air pollution impacts lots and lots of organs. Yes, we breathe it in, we breathe it in and you get increased respiratory disease mortality, increased morbidity, lung cancer, pneumonia. But even though it just comes into the lung, it impacts multiple other organs. You get strokes, you get cardiovascular mortality, you get premature birth and decreased birth weight, you get vascular dysfunction with high blood pressure and DVTs, you get diabetes. And yes, I added this, but I'll tell you about chronic kidney disease to follow up on that piece. The ones in black, in boldface, are really where we have the strongest data. One of the things that's challenging as you read about air pollution is there are those who will say, gosh, everything is caused by air pollution. And while I think there are ties to many, many things, I try to be very scrupulous about looking and saying, okay, where is there solid data? How good are the studies? How strong are the comparisons? Because we really need to understand where there's an association and where we think there's a real causal relationship. So for cardiovascular disease, it's a very solid relationship. So for long-term pollution, we know from national cohort studies that there's a strong relationship between your average PM2.5 levels over a year and your risk of cardiovascular mortality. And the cardiovascular risk increases by about 10% for every 10 micrograms per cubic meter annual average number you have. And this has been looked at multiple times. It was summarized here in a nice paper in 2016. To give you perspective, we're pretty fortunate in terms of our annual average numbers in Utah. We range between 8 and 12 most of the time. So a 10 microgram change it would be a big change for us. But it's a very important effect. In terms of short-term effects, this is a very nice study that Arden Pope down at BYU did with colleagues in Salt Lake City at Intermountain. And they found that they looked at the risk of an acute coronary event in 1 to 3 days after the onset of increased PM2.5. And they found a 4% increase for every 10 microgram per cubic meter increase in PM2.5. That's just over 1 to 3 days. And realize when I showed you those inversions before, we were going from levels of about 10 to 15 up to 60. So if you say for every 10 microgram per cubic meter increase, we're getting to some real numbers here. Going to jump from cardiac disease to asthma. And this is a study that I think is kind of fun and gives you a very nice indication of how acute things are. This was a study they did in London, and it was published in the New England Journal. It's a simple idea. I wish I'd done it. They took a bunch of folks who had mild to moderate asthma, and they had them take walks. And they had them on different occasions. They took a 2-hour walk in Hyde Park in this pristine environment, and then on a different day, separated by a good bit, they had them take a 2-hour walk along Oxford Street with diesel taxis, buses, everything. And they assessed what the pollution exposures were, how their lung function changed, and how much inflammation they had in their airways. And the levels of PM2.5 are meaningful numbers. Hyde Park looks a lot like us on a good day, and Oxford Street looks like us on a fair day. This is looking at FEV1. You know, for pulmonary function tests, we have people take a deep breath, blow out as hard as they can, and we measure the amount they blow out in the first second, the forced expiratory volume in 1 second. And it's a very useful parameter for COPD, for asthma, giving you a sense of lung function. When they walked around in the low pollution environment, yeah, they took a walk, and this was just terms of percent change from baseline, tiny little change, and then it came back to baseline and sort of stayed there. If they walked around in the more polluted environment, they had a statistically significant drop. And the interesting thing was this was a 2-hour walk. Lung function stayed low, and then when they brought them back the following day, their lung function was still low. So they had abnormal lung function triggered by this 2-hour exposure to pollution. And when they had nice correlation with the particular individual pollutants, and when they measured a number of markers of airway inflammation, they all bounced up with the pollution. Another study, this one looking at neurologic issues. And we talk about strokes, and I could show you stroke data, but this one I think is really got my attention. This is from the from the Nurses' Health Study. And large number of nurses were enrolled many years ago and followed for health over many years. Very generous by all these folks. And we've gained a great deal of information about cardiovascular disease, about breast cancer, lots of things. For this one, they looked at 19,000 women who, when they were assessed, were at age 70 to 81. And they tracked back where they'd lived and their exposures to PM2.5. And they did a number of sophisticated tests of cognitive function to look at their cognitive decline that we might think was associated with aging. And they found that for every increase of 10 micrograms per cubic meter of particulate matter long term, that they had more rapid decline in cognitive function. And it was the equivalent for every 10 micrograms per cubic meter of losing 10 years and having being 10 years further out in terms of their cognitive decline. Now, air pollution, we hear on the news a lot about kids, and it's tremendously important for kids. If you live in an area with increased air pollution, you have an increased instance of asthma, you have more acute exacerbations, but you also have less lung growth. Nice study in California where they took freshmen in college and said, okay, we'll do pulmonary function tests, we'll see how large your lungs are now, and then we'll do all your demographics and size, and we'll track back and look at whether you live close to a roadway, how much pollution you were exposed to. And those who were exposed to more pollution growing up had smaller lungs by the time they got to college. There's also some softer data about potential loss of IQ points due to growing up in a more polluted environment. And I haven't included on this slide, again, remember that air pollution causes premature births, so we then have the burden of prematurity to carry the rest of their lives. So, we're going to talk about kidney disease for a second. Is there a risk of chronic kidney disease associated with increased exposure to particulate matter? There's reason to believe there might be. I've told you up front that PM2.5 is associated with hypertension. It's associated with endothelial cell dysfunction, oxidative stress, diabetes. And so I'm going to show you a paper that was done looking at an observational cohort of a great many veterans followed for 8.5 years. And they did a nice job of assessing their ground level PM2.5. And then they came back and actually used satellite monitoring from NASA to confirm these estimates. And I'm sorry for the size of these. The journal wouldn't let me print them in larger format. But this is looking at some relative risks, in particular risks of decreased GFR, of instant CKD, of rapid decline in GFR or of end-stage renal disease. And we've got the sort of the survival probability, the likelihood of not having had each of these here in these left graphs. And as you can see in each one, we're going down. You've got, and what they're saying is that the worse the pollution is, the more rapidly things decline. On this side, we have the relative risk versus PM 2.5. So the higher your PM 2.5 levels, the higher the relative risk of decreased GFR, of instant chronic kidney disease, of rapid GFR decline, and of end-stage renal disease. So it clearly has significant impact. Whether it's via all the vascular issues or some other effect, we don't know that yet. This is a graph, these are pictures that look at the national burden of kidney disease that's attributable to air pollution. So if you said, if we kept everybody's PM 2.5 levels below 12 micrograms per cubic meter, which is actually what's considered a good air day, and if the whole country was there, how many cases would we be rid of? Or conversely, how many more cases do we have because our air pollution is above 12 micrograms per cubic meter? And the increased number of cases are shown here as the colors get redder. So we've got increased numbers, and those are particularly in the eastern part of the country, Southern California, and then, up here. If we made air quality better, if we hit a lovely number of about 6 micrograms per cubic meter, which is, I'll explain in a minute why we need to get down there, we have a huge burden of chronic kidney disease across the whole eastern part of the country, northern Utah, Southern California, and the Northwest. So it's an important contributor to chronic kidney disease. Now, how does air pollution do all this? It comes into your lungs, right? I can see why you'd get irritation there, but why do so many other systems become involved? And we know a fair bit about this. We know that when the particles come in, some ultrafine particles may actually go through the wall of the alveolar space into the blood and be transported to the endothelium, to the brain, coronary vessels, and have direct effects. There are studies that came out of Mexico City where they actually did autopsies with electron microscopy, and they found particulate pollution in the brains of individuals. My view is that's a minority of the effect. It's important, but it's probably a minority. I think what happens often is that in the lungs, you develop inflammatory mediators that are released that trigger hypercoagulability in the blood, that trigger, again, chronic inflammation. We think about coronary artery disease, diabetes as inflammatory processes, and they contribute to the endothelial dysfunction and get us to the heart, the brain, the kidneys. At the same time, we know that air pollution generates reactive oxygen species that are distributed. It also causes autonomic effects with autonomic dysregulation. One of the things that my colleague Rich Canner discovered years ago, they were doing a study of air pollution, and they put sat monitors on patients that were recording, and they looked to see how patients' oxygen saturations changed when we had an inversion. And they were disappointed to see that they didn't actually go down, they went up because the patients were breathing a little harder. But what they did find was heart rate variability changed. And I don't know if you realize that heart rate variability is a very good indication of how stressed your cardiovascular system is. Normally, we all have considerable variation in our RR intervals as you take a breath, as you just move around a little bit. But when your system is stressed, those RR intervals become very regular. Your heart rate becomes much less variable. And that's a sign of how pushed you are. And if you take people and put them in inversions, they get greatly decreased heart rate variability as a sign of the level of cardiovascular stress and the activation of the autonomic system. Now, I'm going to shift for a short second. I've talked about PM 2.5 so far most of the time, but I'm going to shift to ozone. We know that ozone in the stratosphere is a good thing. It protects us from bad things from the sun, but at ground level, it's a problem. The EPA has a standard in parts per billion of 70, and that we get summertime ozone along the Wasatch Front. We also get wintertime ozone in the Uinta Basin. And when you get high levels of ozone, you get increased exacerbations of asthma, you get increased acute exacerbations of COPD, and we don't really have nearly as much understanding of the of the long-term effects of consistently higher levels of a higher, and there is no annual threshold for ozone the way there is for PM 2.5. There's been some recent data, though, looking at this. This came out of JAMA in 2020. They looked at average ozone levels at some cities: New York, Baltimore, San Francisco. Here's Salt Lake City, a little higher. Okay, and they said these were 10-year average levels. All of them are below EPA standards for the 8-hour level, but there is some variability. And when they looked at this, they found that these are lung parameters here. This is the percent of emphysema. This is a symptom score, probability of exacerbations, and this is FEV1 as a percent, pulmonary function. FEV1 is a percent predicted. And in each instance, when they looked at average ozone concentration, they found the higher the ozone concentration, the worse you were. And this holds up. This is change in symptom score for every 5 parts per billion. And if you were higher, things got worse. And if you were a smoker, you were still susceptible. So ozone is a bad thing acutely, but it also is chronically a problem. We need to pay a lot of attention about ways to reduce ozone. Now, COVID-19 actually interfaces with air pollution. During the lockdown in the pandemic back 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, there was improved air quality because people were all working from home, factories were shut down, and so on. But the flip side is we discovered that air pollution is associated with increased risk of and poor outcomes from pneumonia. We've done some general pneumonia studies in Salt Lake City and published that when air quality is worse, particularly individuals over 65 have higher risk of pneumonia, of ending up in the hospital, and of dying. So we also know that air pollution is associated with increased risk of ARDS, of the acute respiratory distress syndrome, if you've had something that triggers it. These are all studies, and I'm not expecting you to be able to read these. These are studies from the United States, Netherlands, England, looking at COVID outcomes in relation to pollutants, particularly PM 2.5. And in every instance, the outcomes are worse if you're exposed to higher levels of pollution. So yes, COVID and pollution do come together, and pollution is a bad thing. Now, I've given you a lot of bad news about pollution. So here's the question. Do efforts to improve air quality make a difference? Can we change health? This is the same 6 city studies, and they came back a number of years later and looked to see how pollution had changed and how mortality had changed. And you see how, yes, the pollution improved and the mortality rate went down in each instance. Well, Topeka sort of had a little trouble, but they didn't have much change. Anytime there was significant improvement in air quality, the mortality rate improved. There have been some detailed studies done by Arden Pope. Arden's down at BYU and is really one of the godfathers of air pollution work nationally. He's actually an economist who brought statistical skills to studying air quality. He's a wonderful man. And Arden led a study comparing the late 70s and early 80s with the 90s and 2000s, and looked to see if we controlled for everything else and just look at the effects of air quality, how that relates to mortality. And they found that air quality had improved over the time. Life expectancy had also improved. It had increased by about 2.7 years. And air quality always tracked very nicely with it. And a reduction of 10 micrograms per cubic meter in the average PM 2.5 gave you 0.6 years increased in life. And this benefit happened at whatever level you started from. So overall, it contributed about 15% of the improvement in air in life expectancy. This is actually an important graph from the New England Journal from 2019. They looked at not long-term exposure, but short-term exposure. They looked at a rolling 2-day average exposure. And here's PM 2.5 concentration. This double dotted line is the US 35 micrograms per cubic meter that we talked about. Here's sort of our real nice target for 25. And this is mortality. And this is a very interesting curve. When you've got bad pollution, it makes mortality worse. But it's not as steep as it is down here at the bottom. When pollution isn't all that bad, but making it a little worse makes your mortality get worse very quickly. And it suggests there really is no safe level, that improving air quality is always going to be a benefit. Another example for improving air quality and how it changes things comes from down in Utah Valley, Geneva Steel. Now, I was not in Utah when Geneva Steel was in operation, but it was a big plant down there, and they had a shutdown. And it had to do with a takeover and maybe a strike, and there were about 18 months when Geneva Steel was shut off. And that's a long enough period to look and see how the local air quality changed and what was happening to kids. And this was a pediatric study, and here's the air quality, and they were measuring 10 micrograms per cubic meter at that point. And this is the high levels for months, and when the plant was operating, when it shut down, and when it was operating again. And then they looked at children's respiratory hospital admissions. If you just look at over here at the total number, here was their average when the plant was running. When they shut the plant down, they cut the number of pediatric hospital admissions in half for respiratory disease. And then they opened it back up. And guess what happened? The number of admissions went back up as well. Wildfires are really important. This is quoting the Salt Lake Tribune. How bad is this year's wildfire season? Actually, not so bad unless you're trying to breathe. Wood smoke, we think about sitting around at the holidays in the fireplace and it all smells good. Wood smoke's terrible. It's got fine particles, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides. Also, because we're at the urban-rural or urban-wild interface, often you're burning not just trees and grass, but lots of man-made materials that produce lots of other things. So we have respiratory irritants that mess up cellular function. We've got carcinogens of a couple different flavors, including the dread dioxin. And we know that wildfire activity around the world is associated with increased ER visits, increased acute respiratory distress hospital visits, increased hospital admissions, more asthma medications, decreased lung function, increased evidence of inflammation in the blood, and in fact, if you focus on people of Medicare age, increased mortality. So, what do I tell my patients? Oh, I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Excuse me. There's a constant argument in Salt Lake about those refineries, because a lot of people say that's just steam, that isn't any pollution, and the other people say it's all pollution. What is it? Is it really?
It's both. So the refineries are important sources. The issue with one of the key issues with the refineries is they monitor at the smokestacks, and the monitoring's pretty good and is generally within range. The problem is they've got miles and miles of pipes, and they've got leaks that can occur all over the place, and none of that's monitored. So living downwind of a refinery is not great. They're better than they used to be. The regulation is improved, but I don't think we have a full understanding of all the emissions from the refineries. Okay, so what do I tell my patients? I love exercise. I want all my patients to exercise. It is a great thing to do controlled exercise, but pollution and exercise, is there an issue there? This is looking at particle deposition for PM 2.5 if you exercise. And this is the number of, this is the fraction of particles that go in, because if you breathe faster and harder, particles are deposited more because of the turbulence. And because you're breathing more, if you look at the total number of particles deposited, it goes way up during exercise. So I don't want people exercising in a polluted environment. I thought this one's kind of cute. This took elite cyclists and had them exercise either in a higher pollution, a sort of a lower particulate matter environment or a higher particulate matter environment, and look to see what their maximum was. How much could they do? And this is a funny scale. It's the work accumulated, and we started 100, so it seems that's not that big a difference. And if this drop in the higher, when they did it in a little more pollution, that's the difference between the gold medal winner and the last place finisher in the cross-country skiing events here in Salt Lake City in the Olympics. So yeah, if you care about your exercise performance, exercising in pollution is bad for your health, it's also bad for your performance. So what do I tell my patients? I tell them to pay attention to air quality. They need to see if their symptoms are changing. When air quality is poor, it's particularly important they use all their medications properly. That's not a time to say, oh, I'll decide to skip my statin or my beta blocker or my inhaler. During bad air days, I tell them to think about what they're doing. It's a great time to cross-train. Don't exercise outside, exercise in the gym. If you can go up into the mountains and exercise, great. If you're exercising even in town, exposures are worse next to roadways than further away, so stay away from major roadways. And I made this slide a while back and said I was starting to think about masks for high-risk individuals. We all live with masks now. Now the KN95s and surgical masks don't do much for air pollution. You've got to have a well-fitted, a well-fitted N95 mask for it to actually help you with air pollution. People should be aware of the air quality index. Now the air quality index, I'll explain how we get here. It's just a number where you're okay up to 100, and then when it's above 100, things are bad. But how does that track to the numbers we were just talking about? Well, they made this air quality index in order to be able to handle both PM 2.5 and ozone. So you've got different numbers for each one. But my 35 micrograms per cubic meter and my 70 parts per billion of ozone show up here at the top of the moderate range. So it's worth people pay attention, know what the air quality is, and adjust their activity based on that. Now, this is my last slide, but I think it's a really important one. The EPA revised their standards in 1990. And as part of a celebration that they did, they said, okay, how many cases have we prevented in 2020 from the changes we made to improve air quality back in 1990? And it's a pretty impressive list. Adult mortality, this was in the year 2020, 230,000 lives. Infant mortality, ozone had an effect. This was particles, this is ozone. Cases of chronic bronchitis, acute myocardial infarction, the asthma exacerbations. But I want to emphasize the part down here. Days lost from work, 17 million. Lost school days, about 5.5 million. So I'm going to make an argument that even from from the Chamber of Commerce perspective, we're degrading our workforce as we expose people to worse air quality. And we'll improve the quality of life for all of us if we can improve air quality. Now, they made these changes in 1990. How expensive was all this? It cost a lot. But if you look here, they were estimating about $65 billion. This is the benefit they estimated from all of this, from the productive lives saved and so on. And it's a $2 trillion benefit. It's a pretty good return on investment. So, yes, we should all be working to improve air quality every way we can. And with that, I'll stop and be happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
I just was wondering, it's a really good presentation, thank you. What can I do?
I think certainly the most important thing to do is to be aware, to be talking about it. There's a lovely piece NPR did with one of my colleagues in Boston, Mary Rice, showing how she talks to her patients about air pollution and air quality and these things. Yeah, I should have put a link up to it because it's beautiful. I think we need to talk to our patients and our colleagues. In truth, we have to do regulatory things, and I think to be sure our representatives know that we care about this. There has been a tendency over the years for them to hear about it acutely when there's a bad inversion, worry about it, and then it all goes away and nobody worries and it comes back next year. We've been much better about having consistent messaging and having people who consistently think about it. I think that last slide I showed about cost benefit is the one we need to be sure people understand, that it's easy to see the cost of improving air quality. It's hard to see the benefit because it's spread out over people, spread out over time. But we need to remind them of the benefits. But stay involved, talk about it, and realize we all contribute. So yeah, turn down your thermostat and put on a sweater. Don't idle. You know, try to drive something that doesn't emit too terribly, and you know, hang in there. But overall, we're getting better. But with a larger population, we clearly have a long way to go.
Yeah, so a few years ago, I presented some research here when I was trying to correlate the finish times for the Ogden Marathon with the PM 2.5 in the area. It didn't work because we had great weather all those days. So my question for you is, having been working in this, I've heard about some newer devices that are kind of a smaller PM 2.5 collection devices. What kind of research tools do you use for this?
So, great question. So most of the data we see is actually comes from regulatory monitors, where they put something up, they blow air through it, collect the air, collect on a filter that PM 2.5 can't get through and other stuff can, and then they weigh the filters and see how much there was per cubic meter of air that went through. There's a real problem with those. I mean, they're spectacularly accurate, but we've got just a few around, and they're not next to your house, and they're not, you know, where you are. And we've worked around that in a couple ways. There's a network called Purple Air that is inexpensive monitors that are not of that grade, but that people can put at their homes, and then they all network together so you can get a sense of really, you know, you get better truth because you look at a lot of them. I think it costs about $250 to get a Purple Air monitor at this point, and then sign on to the network. There also, though, now are small things that are wearable, where you can actually see what individuals are exposed to as they go along. In Salt Lake, there is a monitor on tracks, which is, of course, electric, that goes and samples all over the place. And that data you can get to online and see what it's doing. So it's clear we need more granular monitoring. One of the things is that the monitors tend to be put in places where they won't give us terrible results. You don't want to put your monitor right next to a factory or right next to the highway. So the monitors are sometimes a little better than what many people are exposed to. So yeah, we're getting, the low-cost networks are a huge help, and then the individual monitors are coming along. Yeah.
Yes, how about the electric cars? Are they making any difference, or is enough of them left? I mean, driving that effect.
So a shout out to the EPA. So the fact that cars are cleaner than they used to be has had a huge impact. The Tier 3 gas that the state pushed has had a huge impact. An electric car is really good, but you got to think through the whole supply chain for that. So if the electric car gets charged from solar panels on your roof, wow. You then just have to figure out what happens to the battery when it dies. But if the electric car is charged from the grid with the electricity, it depends on where it comes from. Now in Utah, we still get a fair bit of electricity from coal-fired power plants, and they are quite problematic. the kind of funny piece is none of them are located in our, in the valleys that have the inversions. So we don't get our local pollution as much from them. They contribute pollution that blows on further east, and it bothers the people locally some, but because it's not trapped in the valleys, it's not as much of a problem. But electric cars are a great improvement. Other questions?
I was wondering, how do the bad wildfire air days compare with like the inversion days in the winter here in Utah?
Great question. They can be every bit as bad. So, of course, this depends on wind and where you are and everything else. There have been some we certainly have big bumps that we see that can get as bad as our wintertime inversions. In 2 years ago, when they had the Paradise Fire in Napa Valley, they got levels up as high as 400. Our inversions get up to 60 to 100. They were living for days at 400. We've been up, we've had to bump up into 80 to 100 here, or even higher. There's another one, just to know, on both the 4th of July and on Pioneer Day, the fireworks, we will get levels that will drive the monitors up to 100. Now, those are short-lived, which is great, but it's a real deal. Okay, thank you very much. Oh, another question?
One more question as I
Sure.
come up to introduce our next speaker. How about cigarette smoking?
Okay, well, I assume you will not be surprised if I say cigarette smoking's terrible, and you shouldn't do it. A lot of people want to know, can we just say how many cigarettes are the equivalent of a bad day in an inversion? And it doesn't really, unfortunately, it doesn't really work that way. It is, yes, you're breathing in smoke. It is the same. We're taking toxins and just sucking them in. And certainly if you look at cancer risk, lifelong exposure to pollution, lifelong exposure to cigarettes are both very, very real. But I can't give you a straight how many packs, does your non-smoking patient who lives next to a highway, how many packs is that equivalent to? I wish I could. They're both bad. Thank you all very much.